In Lecture D of Chapter 24, we're going to actually look at urine formation. So we know again that we can have either hypertonic or hypotonic urine. So what we described earlier was concentrating the urine, making it hypertonic. That's that first void every morning. But as you go through the day, more and more liquids are taken into the body. That is going to, or should change, the consistency of your urine all throughout the day. So we know that the osmolarity within the filtrate will change at different regions of the nephron until when the fluid hits the collecting duct, it's now referred to as urine. So if you notice here, the filtrate, of course, is entering into the first part of the PCT. There's exchange of salt and water, so your osmolarity equivalents are about 300. At the beginning of the nephron loop, they arise to 350. More and more water is lost into the interstitial fluid, so at the base of the nephron loop, where it takes the 180-degree turn, it's now at 900 osmolarity units. But because the salt leaves and the water now is allowing it to dilute out a little bit. Notice at the very top it gets to 150 osmolarity units, and then the DCT 100, and then 90 osmolarity units before it hits the collecting duct. By the time the urine is actually formed, you have a dilute urine of about 50 osmolarity equivalents, which is referred to as hypotonic urine. So it's mostly the water that was left over, the residue of the filtrate, but not a high osmolarity, or a very low osmolarity. So how do we make concentrated urine? Well, we know that it's up to the kidneys to conserve large amounts of water for the body to keep us hydrated. We know that there's many metabolic processes, including enzymes that have to be hydrated to function correctly. So it's up to the kidneys to create concentrated urines where the osmolarity units go up to 1200. And there's two different mechanisms that would do this. Antidiuretic hormone is one of the big ones because we know that it acts on the facultative water reabsorption within the distal tubule. There's also the osmolarity gradient within the medulla, so the medullary osmotic gradient created by something known as the countercurrent mechanism. So the gradient exchanges materials in opposite directions between the filtrate and the interstitial fluids as the nephron loop dips on the descending and then the ascending side, and we've said many times the medulla becomes very salty because of that. So again, if you remember salty medulla, like some mixed drink in my mind, the name of that, the salty medulla. So this countercurrent mechanism we know has three factors that are involved. The actual juxtamedullary nephrons, those are the ones, remember, that dip deep into the medulla. They create a countercurrent multiplier system. So countercurrent, you have the fluid going down and then fluid come right back up parallel to it. So that creates the countercurrent part of that. It's dipping into the very salty medulla, so it multiplies the osmolarity of it. So you see that recycling of the urea in the medullary collecting duct is also going to add to the salinity and the gradient that exists within the medulla. And then finally, a third mechanism is the countercurrent exchanger. So we know that with the juxtamedullary nephrons that dip into the medulla, the vasa recta parallels that nephron loop. So there's an exchange between the vasa recta and the nephron loop itself. So if you look at this, we know that the sodium chloride is transported by the thick ascending limb into the interstitial fluid. This is going to, of course, raise the sodium concentration within that fluid. Then the sodium chloride can be pumped into the interstitial fluid. It's going to draw more water out in the thin side by just simply osmosis, and we know that's a passive process. Then there's more and more water loss as we pass around the loop, so the concentration of the filtrate increases as it approaches the bottom of the loop. and the higher sodium concentration of the filtrate now reaches the thick ascending portion of the nephron loop, and that more and more sodium then is reabsorbed from that. So again, it's counter current. You see in every figure steps 2, 3, 4, and the exchange between the thin and the thick segment. So we know that the thick segment is permeable to electrolytes, your sodium chloride. Your thin segment is permeable to water. So this permeability then is going to lead to the urea to establish and maintain the osmolarity within the medullary portion of the renal pyramid. So as the water is reabsorbed from the filtrate, the urea becomes more concentrated as it remains in the fluid. The medullary collecting ducts, the papillary ducts, then the urea follows that concentration gradient and now passively will go and diffuse out into the filtrate and then into the interstitial fluid. So again, this will concentrate your medullary interstitial fluid, keeping the medulla salty. So we see that the medullary osmotic gradient is then maintained by the vasa recta. So this was the step 3, or the counter current exchanger. So we know that the blood in the descending limb of the vasa recta will gain the salt and lose water, and then the blood of the ascending limb will lose the salt and then gain water. So by the time that the vasa recta exit out of the renal medulla, now they have about the same concentration, about 300 osmolarity equivalents upon entering into the renal medulla. So this is allowing the blood to return to its initial osmolarity, and that's a critical thing again, because osmolarity is going to determine blood volume and blood pressure. So it allows the vasa recta to deliver the oxygen and nutrients to the cells of the medulla without depleting that osmotic gradient that exists within the medulla. But this is necessary so that we can reabsorb the water that is needed for homeostasis and to produce concentrated urine. So it's on the back of the vasa recta and the juxtamedullary nephrons to keep the medulla salty. So here again we start off in the cortical collecting duct. The filtrate goes in, the osmolarity units are about 300. But then as it passes into the medulla, notice it gets greater and greater and greater until eventually at step 4 you now have concentrated at 1200 osmolarity units of urine that are produced. And again, this is known as hypertonic urine. This is going to be that first void urine every morning. So in this section we looked at how does the kidneys produce dilute urine. So if you're drinking plenty of water and fluids, most of the time you're going to see a very clear hypotonic type of urine that is known as dilute. We talked about the two mechanisms that would create concentrated urine. So the big thing is the countercurrent multiplier and the overall makeup of both the nephron loop and the vasa recta. And then we describe the countercurrent mechanism, how the osmolarity units change, and the necessity of that.